Good evening, morning, afternoon, or whatever time it may be for you. You are about to listen to a Royal Mirror audio story. The audio will be accompanied with visuals to enhance the experience. However, if you prefer to simply listen, they aren't necessary. If you'd like to follow along, or would simply prefer to read the story, you can find a link to the text in the description below. I hope you enjoy. Now, on to our tale. Godspeed, the Duke of Boots. Part 1. At the base of the Davis Mountains, the refugee paused to get his bearings. He'd crossed the mountains, moving west to east, the sun rising at his front and setting at his back. It would take the tanks, artillery, and other heavy war equipment of the American Provisional Government a while to make their way through the same territory he'd just crossed, especially with the state of the roads. Hopefully, that meant the refugee wouldn't have to deal with any men in uniform asking him uncomfortable questions for the rest of the journey. The man's eyes gazed forward towards the vast open desert and highway in front of him. With the treacherous terrain of the mountains and the soldiers of the APG behind him, a new threat became foremost in the refugee's mind: road gangs. He'd had a few close run-ins with them already. Some of their light scouts combed the edge of the mountains with quads and motorbikes, searching for travelers with anything of value to steal, searching for people like him. The flash of their headlights in the distance always gave them away, and sent the refugee scrambling for a hiding place. Up in the mountains, this had always worked, but down on the open highway, the gangs could move faster, use larger vehicles, and there were less places to hide. As the man made his way towards the highway, he promised himself that he'd find a way to make it through. He had come this far. He wouldn't be stopped now. His feet finally left the dirt and sand and stepped up onto the pavement of the highway. It might have made him a bit more exposed, but he couldn't resist having a smooth, level surface to walk on after all that time in the mountains. Without maintenance, these highways wouldn't be smooth and level for too much longer. The refugee considered that in a few hundred years, people might even forget there ever was a road spanning across the continent of America. It was a good thing that it was here now to get some last use of it, he thought to himself. He just needed to strategize about how long he could spend out in the open on this journey, and how much time he'd have to spend off-road to avoid the bandits. He was suddenly startled out of his thoughts as he caught a flicker of light up ahead. Taking a quick glance around his surroundings, he spotted a burned-out car and made a dive into the wreckage. Hiding in what used to be one of the seats, he peered out of the broken window, down towards the light. He realized quickly, and with deep relief, that the lights weren't getting any closer. In fact, they weren't moving at all. The lights were attached to a building, and not a roving gaggle of vehicles. He had to squint to make it out, but finally he realized what it was. He'd seen them in a few old banned movies, and he'd seen ruined or repurposed versions back in California, but he'd never actually seen one in operation like this before. It was a gas station. Whether it was just curiosity, or a desperation to know that someone was out there living a normal, prosperous life, the refugee crawled out of his brief hiding spot and started making his way in haste down the highway. He started walking quickly. His walk turned into a jog, and then broke into a run. The lights of the gas station got ever closer. Finally, the glass door was just a few feet away. The refugee lifted his hands out towards the door and pushed it open. A soft ding sounded as he opened the door and stepped inside. The first thing he noticed was the temperature. It was cool, almost cold. A welcome respite from the heat, even in the early evening hours. The gas station clearly had air conditioning. "Howdy." A level, casual voice came from the refugee's left, and he turned his head towards it. There was a man leaning up against the wall behind a counter at one side of the gas station. The refugee took a glance at the man behind the counter. He wore an unassuming uniform polo shirt with a name tag that read, Duke. The refugee stood in awestruck silence for a few moments, taking everything in. Then, he started slowly walking down the aisle towards the counter, glancing to his left and to his right. The shelves were completely stocked with food, drinks, and other odds and ends that might be needed while traveling down the road, like first aid, insect repellent, even a few batteries. He reached the end of the aisle and put his hands on the counter, shaking his head in disbelief. Finally, he found some words to speak.
What? What are you doing here?
The refugee asked the man behind the counter. The man responded by raising one eyebrow, his mouth opening into a wry smile, as his shoulders gave the slightest shrug. "Working the till." The man responded simply, just as casually as he'd greeted the refugee in the first place. It was as if the refugee had walked out of California and into a previous, better century. It was alien to him. He shook his head more emphatically now and pushed himself up and away from the counter, gesturing at the building that surrounded them before continuing his questions.
No. Not like you specifically.
He explained with some perturbation.
This whole building, this store, this, whatever you call it, a gas station.
The refugee finally managed to get his whole question out, hoping that the other man understood it this time. Unfortunately for the refugee, the man behind the counter continued playing coy. "It's a Boots gas station. It's on a freeway in Texas. Where else would it be?" The man behind the counter let out a chuckle and continued. "You are familiar with the Boots brand, aren't you? You know, fill your boots." The man quoted the store's tagline as he concluded. The refugee thought about it for a moment. He did know "fill your boots." He'd seen a couple of old advertisements and vaguely recalled the jingle. He also remembered seeing their merchandise a few times. T-shirts, backpacks, and, yes, even boots. The classic, over-the-top cowboy branding of the company had caught on pretty heavily across the US for a while, but those days were long gone. For that reason, Duke's answer only left the refugee more confused.
But the American Provisional Government bought out all private gas stations years ago. How are you still out here running your own boots?
The refugee asked incredulously. The man behind the counter cocked his head to the side and gave another one of his shrugs. "They never bought this one," he said plainly, as it seemed he said most things. He lazily leaned forward and put his arms on the counter, giving the refugee a wink. "Besides, this one ain't for sale. Not even to a bunch of highfalutin pencil pushers pretending to be America." Another chuckle escaped his lips. The refugee stole a glance outside of the gas station's windows and back towards the mountains he'd just descended. He thought about the concentrations of APG troops back in California. Troops who were mustering to make their way out here to Texas, if they weren't already on the march. He looked back towards Duke.
Well, Just so you know, those highfalutin pencil pushers are going to be coming through the Davis Mountains.
The refugee told Duke.
And they're bringing main battle tanks.
The man behind the counter looked up at the refugee and stroked his chin. That so? The man's calm, casual tone was shaken for the first time since he started speaking with the refugee. It was clear he had no love of the APG and didn't revel in the idea of them rolling up to his doorstep. Well, if they're willing to trade their tanks for my little gas station, I just might consider it. Duke flashed the refugee another smile, confidence restored. It seemed the confidence was infectious, as the refugee let out a small laugh. Duke gave the refugee an approving nod and joined him in the laugh. He pushed himself back up to full height and looked the refugee up and down. You know, son, you look like you could use a hot shower, Duke told the refugee, taking in his disheveled state. Frankly, if you don't mind me saying so, you smell like you could use a hot shower too. Duke nodded his head to the left, where the refugee could see a large bathroom sign. Go ahead. Knock yourself out. On the house. He gave the refugee another wink. Don't worry. We keep 'em nice and clean. They're kind of our pride and joy out here. The refugee was unsure. He was worried about being in a new, untested territory. However, he'd already let his curiosity drag him this far, so he decided to take a chance on the washroom. The refugee gave Duke a nod.
Thanks,
The refugee said simply, and made his way to the back, pushing open one of the washroom doors. With relief, he noticed that it had a lock. It seemed the gas station was a gas station after all, and not some elaborate ruse set up by road bandits. The refugee let out a sigh, not quite believing his luck. Duke wasn't lying. The bathroom was immaculate. The refugee briefly enjoyed a flight of fancy to stay here in this bathroom forever, rather than getting back out on the long, difficult, and dangerous road. It wasn't to be, of course, but a man can dream. He reached out and turned on the water, only to be once again shocked that Duke was a man of his word. The water was warm. After the refugee had a nice, long shower, Duke helped him put together supplies from the gas station shelves to bolster the refugee's own remaining reserves, shoving mixed nuts, water bottles, and, of course, beef jerky into the refugee's old duffel bag until it bulged with the contents. The refugee had heard of Southern hospitality before, but he was happy to be experiencing it for the first time. He could only hope it would hold up as he continued on his journey. So, where are you headed? Duke asked from behind the counter. The refugee finished zipping up the bag and swung it up onto his back. He paused for a second, unsure if he should answer. He had kept to himself, even back home in his own neighborhood, with people he knew, let alone with a complete stranger out on the open road. But Duke had been good to him, and it didn't seem like Duke would be leaving the gas station anytime soon.
I'm traveling out east, hoping to make it to the Sky King's territory,
The refugee explained. He cracked a small smile as he looked over at Duke.
I hear he's offering up capital to anyone willing to work with it. Land, factories, computer servers, you name it. If you can run it, he's handing it out.
The refugee took a quick look around Boots.
Who knows? Maybe I'll get a gas station, just like this.
Duke let out a sigh and shrugged. Well, people do a lot more offering than they do giving, especially these days. I wouldn't get my hopes up, Duke told him. The refugee could see the jaded look on the man's face, and could tell he'd learned that from experience. Still, the refugee had to hold on to something, and he wasn't about to give up on the Sky King. Just yet. Before the refugee could muster up a proper response, he heard the distant rumble of an engine, and shortly, bright lights began to shine through the windows of the gas station. The road gang was here, or at least some of them. Duke slipped his hand under the counter, and when it came up, he was gripping a lever-action rifle. He stepped out from behind the counter and started making his way to the door. "Stay behind me," Duke told the refugee as he reached for a brown leather jacket which hung by the door. He propped up his rifle against the wall and put the jacket on, then reached up to grab a white cowboy hat that had been hung up beside the jacket. He placed it on his head and picked his rifle back up. The refugee gave him a look, his eyes focusing on the hat.
"Seriously?"
The refugee asked, questioning Duke's fashion sense. "We are in Texas, son," was Duke's only reply as he pushed open the door and stepped out into the cool desert night. There was one SUV waiting outside on the highway, clearly delineated as a gang vehicle by the flashy red markings running up and down each side. Duke stopped just past the pumps, holding his rifle in clear view. The refugee stayed behind him as ordered and watched. A black glove emerged from the passenger side window and gave a wave before the door opened, and a man clad in jeans, a black leather jacket, and matching bandana climbed out of the vehicle. He shot a mean smile towards the cowboy, his scraggly salt and pepper beard doing little to make the look more appealing. "Dookie, my man, think you can fill her up for me?" The bandit asked, reaching up to slap the hood of his SUV with that leering grin still plastered over his face. His leather jacket rose just enough to show a rusted machine pistol tucked into the waist of his jeans. "Nope," was Duke's simple reply. He pointed his rifle towards the ground just ahead of the bandit's feet, ready to raise it at a moment's notice. The bandit put his hands up and shrugged, then pointed at the refugee behind Duke. "Come on, Duke. You gave him plenty of nice things." The bandit put on a fake, whining tone as he continued. "How's the APG gonna feel about this? I mean, it's pretty discriminatory, don't you think?" He cocked his head towards Duke, awaiting a reply. "Yeah," was all Duke gave him, keeping his weapon lowered but steady, not escalating the standoff any further, yet. The bandit scrunched up his face and nodded, considering his options. He squinted his eyes and peered at the gas station, then at the rocks and the mountains behind it, before spinning and taking a quick glance down the road from which he came. He was looking for something, or someone. The refugee realized that the bandit was probably looking for other people who might be defending the gas station. He quickly peered around as well, before the bandit spun back. "You working the counter all by yourself tonight, Duke?" the bandit asked, his tone turning serious, hand inching closer to the pistol at his waist. "Why don't you try it and find out?" Duke replied. The bandit's face broke back out into a smile. He lifted his finger in the air and wagged it accusatively at Duke. Nah, I ain't that dumb," the bandit replied, turning and walking back to the door of the SUV and throwing it open. He turned back to Duke. "I'll come back with the rest of the fellas and maybe we'll give it a spin then." The man was about to close the door when he stole one last look at the refugee. "Oh, and be careful out there on the road, buddy. You never know what kind of nasty characters you could run into." The bandit let out one more laugh that was muffled by the closing of the door. The SUV revved its engine once, and then pulled a U-turn, driving back off in the direction he'd come. Duke kept his rifle at the low ready, both he and the refugee staying silent until the lights of the SUV had disappeared over the horizon and the sound of its engine had faded away. Duke spat in the direction the bandit had taken off. "Be seeing you," he stated simply, looking off towards the bandit's dust trail for a few more moments, as if he expected the gang might roll back in that night. Finally, he let one hand off of his rifle and turned back to face the refugee. "Night's the best time to move in these parts," Duke told him, looking back over his shoulder towards where the bandits had gone. "And it would be best if you stayed off the road. I saw you coming from a few miles off," he explained to the refugee, who replied with a nod.
"Thanks, Duke,"
the refugee said. He took a quick glance back through the windows of the gas station at the rows of goods.
"Say, a gas station's supposed to be a store, right? People usually pay for the stuff they get there?"
Duke shrugged. These days, people who can pay. People who can't need all the help they can get," he explained. The refugee thought for a few moments, then reached into his pocket and pulled out a black rectangle. It took Duke a few moments, but he finally recognized it as a smartphone. The refugee held it out for Duke.
"What do you think? Could I pay with this?"
Duke reached out a hand and took it, looking it over. The community could definitely use some replacement electronics. He glanced back up at the refugee, tapping the device's screen. "You know, these things are typically worth a lot more than a few snacks for the road," Duke replied with concern. The refugee shook his head.
"Not worth anything to me. Left cell service days ago, and ran out of batteries a while after that."
He glanced to his left and then to his right, still accustomed to living in a big city with dozens of prying eyes and ears all around him.
"Besides, I've heard the APG can track people with them."
Duke cracked a smile. "Well, I suppose if you insist, I can certainly use it," he answered. The refugee returned the smile and reached out his hand.
"Well then, it's been a pleasure doing business with you, Duke,"
the refugee stated. Duke reached out and shook his hand. As their hands parted, Duke reached up and gave a slight tip of his hat to the other man. "A pleasure," he replied affirmatively. The refugee turned and began to walk, due east this time, not following the road. The gas station owner gave him a few last parting words. "Once the Sky King makes you rich and famous, feel free to come back out this way and stop by again." The refugee gave him a thumbs up and one last wave before setting out on a long journey. It was a journey that would, fortunately, be easier thanks to his serendipitous stop at Boots. His mind wandered back to some of those old band movies he'd watched. At the end, the hero always rode off into the sunset. But in a few hours, he'd be walking into a sunrise, a new beginning. This concludes our Royal Mirror audio story for this video. I hope you've enjoyed it. I'd like to give an extra special thank you to postmodern Czechoslovakian War Factory for playing the refugee in this story. You can find a link to his channel below. If there's an additional part to the story, it should appear in the description below when it is available. I'd like to take this time to thank all of the creators of the open source content used in this video, the ultimate creator, without whom any further creation would be impossible, and of course you, the viewer, for listening to it. Until we meet again, goodbye.